This is my current workbench light setup, and while this looks like more than adequate lighting, this is how it feels when I'm doing something that needs a lot of attention to small detail. I fell in love with these GU10 LED bulbs when I made my bandsaw light a couple years ago. For tiny bulbs, they create an enormous amount of light. Today, let me show you how I made this vertical scissor light trolley that uses 4 of those GU10 LED bulbs and has an 8-foot traveling range. In the first part of this build, we're going to build a scissor arm that will retract back above us after we're done with their light. As you can see, I cut several boards on my table saw. I used and recommend using hardwood only. After all were cut, I used a jig on my drill press to drill equal size holes on opposite ends as well as the center. Be sure your maple holes are slightly bigger than your walnut holes. The scissor arm will be 3 boards wide, 2 walnuts with a maple sandwich in the middle. The 2 walnut boards will be glued to a pin. I made pins out of maple on my miter saw, but obviously you can buy dowels. Again, I'd stick with hardwood. You'll lay out your bottom walnut boards, add glue to each hole, and then your peg. You've got to make sure you don't get any glue above the walnut board. We'll add washers, and then we'll create a crisscross with our maple. As you can see, we skip the middle and bottom hole, instead adding bolts. Then we'll add the second row of washers. I used a deep well socket to hammer the links together. And here it is, all put together. Next, we'll make the fixture plate. You know, the thing you put the bulbs in. You certainly don't have to go to the extremes that I went to make this, and could very easily go with a plain board. Even pine would work fine. I joined a few boards together and added a pattern. I'll have the pattern in the description if you'd like to use it. After I made the fixture plate, I built myself a handle, something that allows me to drag the unit along the rails as well as pulling it down when it comes time to use it. You could, of course, use a metal handle from the store. As this is a making channel, I'm naturally going to try to steer you away from doing that. The handle that I made is a combination of cherry and maple wood, and this design that I'm making on the bandsaw is very easy to make. Now that that's done, we'll cut the scissor arm at the end, where we put one of the bolts. We're doing this so that we can connect a swivel point that will connect our light to the scissor arm. The swivel point will swivel both directions, front to back and side to side for more control of where the light goes. Speaking of swivel arm, let's go ahead and cut it out. Here I used the leftover scrap for my handle. I cut a channel out of the bottom on my table saw before cutting out the shape on my bandsaw. I used my strip sander to round the inside a little just to squeeze out a little more movement out of it. Because it needs to swivel on a bolt, I took it to my drill press and drilled out a hole for a 1/4-inch bolt to pass through. This end will connect to my scissor arm. I brought it back to the bandsaw and rounded the bottom half that will pivot on the light, as well as giving it a 1/4-inch hole that will connect to the light. If we look at the final model again, I can show you how the pivot on the swivel point connects to the light. This is the pivot point we just finished. These curved sections here are glued to the actual light. We'll need to make the curved sections as well as add a hole so that it can connect to the swivel point. With that done, we can't glue it until we cut out the wiring case. What I call the wiring case is really nothing more than a block of hard maple cut on the table saw so that 1/8-inch walls are all that remain. The walls are thin enough that we can drill a hole and add an on-off switch. Wiring, yeah, I'm not going to get into specifics of how to wire these. There's nothing to it, I'll tell you that. If you have access to the internet, and you do, there are simple diagrams you can look up that'll tell you how to wire a simple light to a switch. I use lever nut wire connectors as they're incredibly simple to use and wired everything together. I did show a little more of this part of the build on the director's cut version of this video. I'll explain that video in a little bit. Gluing was done here without clamping. If you'd never heard of doing this before, you basically add your glue and rub it in against the place that you want to glue to and allow it to sit while it dries. While it does work, You'll want to check back on it every few minutes for about 30 minutes to make sure it hasn't moved. While that's drying, we'll head back to the swivel point connect and add a hole that's large enough for this 3/8 air hose to fit through. We'll put it at the very lowest point so that it doesn't interfere with movement. Because we don't want wire hanging all over, we're going to use 2 sections of coiled air hose and add 2 wires, which will allow the coil to keep the wire from hanging on us. I inserted the small of the 2 sections of coiled hose into the hole we just drilled and finished wiring the light. Now we'll screw the wiring case, light fixture, and handle together. Let's work on the trolley. The trolley, for a lack of a better word, will run along 2 conduit tubes. I used 2 pieces of Baltic birch and 3 half-inch tubes. I cut one of the pieces of Baltic birch so that it sandwiched the tubes on top of the second one. After I finished that, I epoxied the tubing in. With my lathe, I carved out 6 wooden wheels or casters that fit around the pipe. But to be brutally honest, you don't even need a lathe or even wheels to do the same thing. Instead of using 3 small tubes, you could use longer tubes that would just slide along the metal tubing. Let's work on the other half of the scissor arm. This half will be connected to the trolley or part that will run along the rails above. The scissor arms will both need different connectors. The single will need a slot to slide along as it moves, while the double arms will need a pin. I used a couple blocks of wood and cut out slots with my scroll saw. If you don't have a scroll saw, you can use a bandsaw, cut out the side, and add a section back with glue. After I made a couple of these, I screwed them on. To finish this part of the arm, we'll need to use spacer blocks to fill the compartment in the middle. The second part is actually a little easier than the first, as we'll just use one of the arms we cut earlier, cut a slot in the wood, glue, and slide it in place. Just to be safe, I cut another piece of plywood and attached it over the tubing using wood glue. To hang the rails, I cut a couple boards that are shaped like H's. I attached the pipes so that they fit on either side, drilling and then adding 2-inch wood screws to hold them on. To be fair, these screws are just there to keep the tubes from sliding out. None of the weight will actually affect them. Be sure you put the second coiled tubing on the pipe before adding the second bracing. To add the wheels, I ran threaded rods through the tubing and through each wheel using jam nuts to lock them on. If you've wondered what that second bolt on the scissor arm was for, it's to lock the arm in place. You could use a cheap store-bought knob, or you could make one yourself. Guess which one I prefer? One of the really big problems that I ran into was trying to figure out how to keep the trolley from being pulled back due to the tension in the coil. The last thing you really want to do is try to balance it so that it stays where you want it to stay. To fix this problem, I added a brake. It's nothing more than a board on a hinge with 2 rare earth magnets, but it does a really good job of staying where you want it to stay. Now that I have my light, it makes it easy to pull it where I want to get the best light that I need. If you'd like to see more of this video and hear less of me, I have an extended video you can watch on my second channel. I also have a video showing how I made the knob that was used in this video. All the jigs I use in this video will also have links in the description below. I've also entered this video in a challenge, and a link to that challenge will also be down below. Hit the thumbs up, subscribe, ring the bell, and I thank you so much for being a part of my shop. Please leave a comment below, come find me on Instagram at MakeThingsWithRob, and remember to keep making things.